Good afternoon and good morning. Welcome to the panel discussion for the film Bedlam. My name is Steve LaMaster and I've worked at Vinfen since 2003, currently serving as Director of Clubhouse and Employment Services. It's an honor to be here as your moderator for the next 45 minutes, but I know you're here not to see me, but instead to hear from our excellent panel. So let me introduce them to you. First, Dr. Kenneth Paul Rosenberg. Kenneth is an addiction psychiatrist and the director, producer, and writer of the film Bedlam. During the film, he also integrates his own story of how the system failed his sister Merle, a person with schizophrenia. He trained first as a psychiatrist in the late 1980s and experienced firsthand the vast closures of state mental health hospitals, which left many patients living nowhere to go. Since medical school, he has worked to bring documentary stories about mental illness to both professional and public attention. Secondly, Dr. McGhee, Julea Leshar McGhee. Leshar appears in the film Bedlam and is a public psychiatrist who specializes in systems-based practice and management of vulnerable populations. She has a passion for tracking severe behavioral illness compounded by socioeconomic challenges. Dr. McGhee also supervises residents working in community psychiatry and trains outreach workers engaging with people who are homeless and have significant mental health conditions. Next, Johanna Marie Swartz. Johanna Marie Swartz, who appears in the film Bedlam, is an artist who uses photography as a way to focus on the beauty in life. Johanna attended Fullerton College and had the opportunity of participating in a cultural exchange student program in Panama. Next, Amy Dahlberg-Chu, CPS. Amy is a certified peer specialist and lead peer specialist at Vinfen. As a peer, Amy enjoys bringing meaning to her struggles with bipolar disorder and post-traumatic stress disorder by offering support and hope to others with mental illness. She once believed that she was too sick to ever work again. However, working at Vinfen has changed that belief. So I want to first turn to you, Ken,
Sure.
and just acknowledge that this film focuses on, of course, the dismantling of the system of institutionalized care, which began with Kennedy in the 1960s and continued through the 1980s without a commitment to replace it with something more humane and helpful. Now, while it can be argued that we did ultimately replace asylums with at least jails, where else might we have committed those resources that may have prevented some of our present catastrophe?
Well, that's a great question. First, let me say, Steve, thank you so much for inviting us, myself and Dr. McGhee and Johanna, and great to be on the panel with Amy. It's a great honor to be part of this, so thank you. So where could we have directed our resources? Well, you know, we still need hospital beds, frankly. You know, we have about 2 or 3% of the state hospital beds now that we had in 1950, and mental illness has not exactly gone away. So I think we certainly need to have hospital beds that are available, acute hospital beds, and probably long-term hospital beds. I think also we need the kind of services that Vinfen provides, frankly, community-based services, peer specialist services, services that enable people to be integrated and live happily and with agency, I should add, because that's very, very important, in the community. There are models for community living aside from what you all do. I mean, there's a great model in Trieste, Italy that I talk about in my book, Bedlam. Trieste is a town of 220,000. It's not like Boston or Los Angeles, but they do a couple of things right. They have 24/7 community-based mental health services. So that means, you know, that you always have someone to talk to, you always have somewhere to go. They have about 3 or 4 hospital beds, by the way, and they have very little use for them because they have so much intensive and, you know, community-based services. So I think if we had that, we would be, you know, far ahead of the curve. They also in Trieste and also in Europe, and especially the Scandinavian countries, have something we don't have, which is universal health care. We have a system that takes care of people acutely, takes care of people with mental illness, frankly, best when they're very, very sick. That's good, but that's not enough. You know, we don't treat cancer only at stage 4 or stage 3. We treat cancer at stage 0. And by the same token, we should treat mental illness any mental illness, but particularly serious mental illness early on. That's, early intervention is really the key to getting people better. It's much easier to help people lead meaningful, productive lives with agency, again, if we catch them in treatment early on and they are, of course, part of that treatment. We need telehealth, and that's what we're doing now, right? We're communicating with you through Zoom. I'm sorry I couldn't be with you in person, but we see that in psychiatry, telehealth is a very, very effective way to communicate. And that's a really good use of resources. And frankly, one of the small blessings, perhaps, of the COVID crisis, that we see telehealth is really an important part of medical health. We certainly need diversion. We need to get people out of the criminal justice system and into treatment, and we need mental health courts, AOT, that sort of thing. We could talk about that more later. And I would say the last place we need to, and maybe the first place we need to put our dollars, is into research. Because at the end of the day, it's not about who's good, who's bad, where people should be. I mean, all that's important, but what's really important is having effective treatments for people with serious mental illness. And we have effective treatments, but they're also old treatments. The medicines we use are by and large decades, if not, some of them are close to a century old. We don't have that in cancer. If you have cancer, God forbid, you have a regimen that's 2 or 3 or 4 years old. If you have a psychiatric disease, you have a molecule or medicine that's based on a molecule that's 50 or 70 years old. So I think we need research. I'll stop there, but I think that's a more effective use of our funds than putting people in jails or catching them on the streets, which is, of course, now where most of the people with serious mental illness end up.
Thank you. So we need new ideas. We need new ideas through research and through proven program models. You referenced the Trieste program in Italy, also Scandinavian programs that show a lot of promise. You mentioned the importance of providing access to peer services and good community support services. And you also identified the critical need for people to have access when they have acute distress to inpatient settings. I have a friend and colleague who attended medical school at Harvard who once said, it is more difficult to get into a public mental health bed than it is to get into Harvard Medical School. And I don't think he was exaggerating too much. There is a significant limit to the access that people have when they need it. I want to turn next to Johanna. And Johanna, a striking statement that you made late in the film was, I would have liked to know when this happened to me. If you're like this, you're not alone. And I wondered when I heard you say that, how did loneliness and isolation contribute to your difficulty early on? And how has it helped to have the experience of knowing that you're not alone over time?
At first, I was very much, I couldn't get out of bed. I felt like a freak. It was very difficult. It was very, very difficult. And then later, it just felt really nice to know that I'm not alone. It felt kind of communal, I guess, and kind of liberating in a way. So that was really nice.
Mm-hmm.
It's still something I struggle with, even though it's still commonly talked about. Even Prince Harry and Meghan Markle talk about it. I still feel alone sometimes, but I really appreciated that they opened up about their stuff, and when people do share, it's I know Conan O'Brien has shared his stuff, and when people talk about it, I'm grateful for it.
Yeah. There's a woman who has lived experience of a mental health condition named Esso Letty, and one of the statements she made years ago that really stuck with me was, our despair disables us more than our symptoms ever could. And you say that still it can be difficult to find that sense of connection. And I think, to Ken's earlier list of things that I think the mental health services world can use, I would say it can use authentic connections. It can use bi-directional relationship opportunities for people to give and receive love and support and make a meaningful contribution. And I think we now know that social isolation kills much more than things like obesity. And we recognize that people with mental health conditions pay a significant price in early mortality largely from social isolation, polypharmacy, sedentary lifestyle, and other preventable aspects that co-occur often with the disability. Leshar, I want to turn next to you. Can I do that?
Sure.
Okay. So a conflict within our present mental health system exists between the freedom of people to self-determine and the responsibility for people who are not exercising their ways that society approves of. And the film ends with the juxtaposed images and sounds of the July 4th fireworks with your statement to not have access to food, housing, medication, medical care. It doesn't make for a good American story. And part of American story is one of struggle and one of reinvention. And people with mental health conditions have advocated for freedom from rejection, from incarceration, and some of the forced treatments that we now recognize as having contributed harm. Is there a way to meet the interests of people who've experienced the negative effects of forced treatment, with the desires of family to get help for their loved one and themselves, and with the need for the system of care to provide equitable and sustainable supports to everybody who truly needs them?
So first, let me say I don't know that I could even adequately answer that question because it's so challenging. But I would say my experience, I've been in the psychiatric emergency room for about 15 years now. And I find that the most disconcerting thing is the lack of nuance in conversations surrounding mental health. It's sort of like an all or nothing conversation. So either, you're locked up in a horrid institution that sees you as a number and not as a human being, and you sort of languish in this institutionalized setting, or you have complete freedom to do and be whoever you want, to live however you want. And I understand that freedom and independence, especially in this country, is an incredibly strong pull. And what I worry is that sort of what's lost in the conversation on either side of those two extremes is that there are all kinds of mental illness and levels of severity. And, you can fall on one spectrum at one point and another spectrum at another point in your life. Or unfortunately, there are some people who are just stricken with a really severe form of illness. And so it's really important to understand that there should be a variety of services to meet the needs of where you happen to be along that spectrum. I understand that for so many years, mental illness was seen as a curse, and the sort of lack of humanity that was applied for people who struggled with mental illness, that it's been necessary to sort of go to the extremes and have people tell their stories and fight for the ability to live independently and function, with mental illness, but with support systems, whatever that is for a certain individual. But I feel that what's been lost in the last, I don't know, 30 odd years of that conversation, and this is really the heartbreak of my work, is seeing people who come into the hospital who literally have been lying on the street in their own feces and urine, and have maggots crawling over them. That's not really, unfortunately, that unusual of an experience in Los Angeles for the homeless population who are struggling with really severe forms of schizophrenia. And if you ask them how they're doing, they'll say they're fine. But that's actually a function of the illness, is that what one person might see and that I see, and I'm shocked and sort of feel that despair for them, they're not feeling, because part of the illness makes them blind to what's going on. And without the ability to have laws that could force treatment, and without having institutions where people can receive 24-hour care, because that's how severe some people are, I feel like that's been lost in the conversation. And again, it's extremely difficult to sort of communicate that nuance when you're making a public statement, or you're at a hearing in front of Congress. It's very tempting just to sort of continue on with a message that's strident and not at all including the sort of different ways in which people can be sick, and that some people need incredible support, and some people just need a little support, and then there's the in between. So I that would be my wish and my hope, is that we could communicate all the ways in which people need help, and frankly, we're failing on all ends. But I because I work with some of the sickest people, that's just something that's near and dear to my heart, because I see that kind of care has almost disappeared entirely. And so I really appreciate the people who are fighting and struggling for their own independence and freedom. And I would just ask them to consider that it wouldn't take away from their argument to acknowledge that there are some people who won't have the capacity to be on a panel like this and tell their story in a documentary like Johanna. Their voices aren't heard because they're frankly too sick to tell their story. So I guess I sort of see my role as being able to tell the story that they can't.
Mm-hmm. And your recommendations reflect a desire to see, as you said, a great variety of resources that span the spectrum of what people need. And it strikes me in hearing you say that as many other things in our society, the conversation between freedom and independence and on one end and care and protection on the other has become more and more polarized. And I wonder to what degree that may exist as an extension of the lack of options and opportunities to provide full quality resources to people everywhere along that spectrum. Yeah. I want to turn now to Amy. And Amy, this film tells a story which desperately needs to be told. There were not many happy moments, and often they were followed by more pain. And I think about Monty's experience and Todd's situations in particular, but also I think about yours, Johanna. And the exception in this film seemed to be the young woman shown first in an emergency room, and then a few years later with braces in adolescence, recounting her suicide attempts and hospitalizations. But finally, her high school graduation, where she raises her fists in triumph as her mother looks on proudly. And often in our lives, these stories of triumph over despair seem to be almost whispered and never shouted. What might be the significance, Amy, of having fewer stories of hope, fewer stories of success, improvement, and adaptation to hang our hats on?
So first, I just want to thank Ken and Leshar and Johanna for having me with you guys today. It's an honor. When I watched Bedlam, I had two reactions immediately. One was intense sadness. And the second one was just how fortunate I've been in my recovery. I have a wonderful husband. I have two kids. You know, I now have a job that I love. And frankly, I have white privilege. But at the same time, it has been incredibly hard. I mean, I've been in recovery for close to 25 years now, and it's still really hard. I think stigma is one of the major reasons that we don't see more success stories. First of all, I think that people, you know, they don't get the supports that they need. They either can't access them or they don't. Frankly, when I was diagnosed at age 26, I didn't even know that there were services I could access. So I just muddled along. An example is just, I was in a PhD program. I was so excited I wanted to be a professor. This is when I was in my mid-20s. And I quickly got diagnosed with bipolar disorder and PTSD. I had a major manic episode. I ended up in the hospital. And when I came back from my hospital stay, my classmates treated me so differently. They had been my friends before, but now they were making fun of me for taking psych meds, talking behind my back, and it was heartbreaking. My professors, they didn't even really acknowledge the struggle. So I tried not to use my illness as an excuse for not getting my work done. So I kind of slogged through the years. And then eventually I walked into my advisor's office one day and I said, hey, you know, I'm really sorry, but I haven't finished this chapter of my dissertation because I've been depressed. And he looked at me and he said, stop. And I was shocked. I thought to myself, God, what would he have said had I walked in there and said I had breast cancer? And I quit that program very soon after that. Like, I just felt so discouraged and it was a huge loss. But getting back to the stigma, I think the other thing is that we often don't feel like we're deserving of help. After that doctoral program, about a year went by and I heard about becoming a peer specialist. And I thought, what a wonderful way to bring something good out of all of this. So I applied for what was then known as the Consumer Provider Program. It was a DMH funded program. I earned a certificate in human services as well as my certification as a peer specialist. And it was very hard. It was a year-long program, but I always saw it as like a gimme. I never gave myself credit for all the work I had put in for that. And I really should have. And the third thing I just wanted to say is that I think we all want to be seen as normal. Not that there is such a thing as normal, but I remember, you know, I was having a lot of fertility issues trying to have our second son. And I just wanted to be like all the other moms on the playground who had like 2 or 3 kids and, you know, they seemed to have it all together. They made it look so easy. So meanwhile, like I had decided I wasn't going to let the bipolar disorder get in my way. And I really wanted a second child. So I ended up doing IVF after about 5 years of trying. Got pregnant after having like shot myself up with hormones for like 6 months, which is a little, you know, dangerous when you have bipolar disorder. And so I got really sick 5 months into my pregnancy. I was having paranoia and delusions. I was agitated. And after I had my son, that continued for like a year. It was really bad. But I wouldn't take it back. It was an incredible triumph for me. And I remember the moment my husband looked at me and he said, "You did it." And I would never take it back. But I did not shout that victory from the rooftops, like Steve said. You know, I just wanted to blend in and be one of those normal moms. So I guess what I'd say is just that we want to be included. You know, people with mental health conditions, we don't want to feel like we're the other or we're wrong. It takes a lot of strength to overcome a mental health challenge. And yeah, I think it would help if we got a little more slack from society and a little more understanding and support.
So for many people, it's the grit and the emotional fortitude to that's required to get to the place where you feel like you don't stand out, where you feel like you're no longer having the finger pointed at you, that people put tremendous amounts of effort into. Yeah. I think we have just enough time for an additional question, and I'll throw this out to anyone. Our society has been more acutely aware over the last year of the relationship between being a person of color and experiencing violence by the police since the murder of George Floyd, of course, but we don't see the same attention given to the relationship between mental health distress and police violence or even killings. And I wonder, what are some thoughts any of you have about the significant relationship between police violence and mental illness and the ways it's compounded when a person is both a person of color and has a mental health condition?
Well, I'll just jump in for a sentence or two, and then I'd love to hear from everyone else, and especially Johanna, who has, we've talked about this quite a bit. Look, if you, about 25% of fatal police shootings have to do with someone who has a mental illness. And I think that the police have a tough job. And I'll be honest, I, for one, don't blame them. Maybe that's unpopular to say these days. I think they have a very tough job. They are first responders, but they need training, and they need more training. And I don't think you could entirely give that job to people who don't have the authority and wherewithal of the police, because I think that they are able to do a lot that just I, as a psychiatrist or a social worker, isn't able to do. However, crisis intervention teams have been proven over and over and over again to save lives and to save a whole ton of money. Yeah, I'd love to hear from everyone else on the panel.
I'm curious what Leshar has to say.
So there's so much history bound up in police action and people of color, and I think it's hard to it's really hard to sort of overcome inherent bias in people, even with a great training. So I think I'm probably a little bit inherently pessimistic about our ability to overcome all of this with training. But we do have in Los Angeles a lot of different kinds of teams that respond to mental health emergencies. We have people who are purely clinical, like a clinical social worker or a nurse or a psychologist who will respond to an emergency, a mental health emergency. We also have sort of a combo where we have one police officer and one clinician. And then, of course, there's just the traditional police. And it sort of depends on what phone number you call as to who responds. And sometimes you wish you had one, and sometimes you wish you had the other, frankly, depending on the situation that presents itself. I have been terrified, I can say, from my own personal experience. My brother who has bipolar disorder, has a really strong prejudice against the police. And when he gets manic, of course, he loses all his good judgment. And it's been my, constant fear that he would tangle with the police. And so I've been lucky in that he calls me when he gets sick, and I can actually show up, and he'll get in my car and we'll drive to the hospital. But everybody knows, anybody, who has a family member with mental illness knows that fear of what might happen if the police show up and things go wrong. So in Los Angeles, while we have all those different kinds of choices to respond to mental health crises, we certainly don't have enough of them. Granted, our county is gigantic. So certainly we need to put more resources into those. And then for all those communities that don't have that, we certainly need to create those programs.
Yeah. Thank you all for your thoughtful comments on that. And if I would just add one thing, in the cities of Cambridge and Somerville, I know that I, as both a Vinfen employee and a resident of the city of Cambridge, am deeply grateful for the leadership of the Cambridge Police Department, as well as the Somerville Police Department, in the ways that they have very thoughtfully integrated crisis intervention into their force. We don't have the same, I think that everyone has a fear, I think, about a family member, about themselves to different degrees, but I don't have the same fear about a person living in Cambridge than I would somebody living in another part of the country. And I think that the lack of that availability of really good crisis intervention training within the force really makes a difference in the sorts of tragic outcomes that we can see. And if I can just take a second to plug the next film that will be after this, people will have the opportunity to learn about cops who are trained to deliver emotional support in times of crisis. And I hope people, if they have the time, will take the time to view that and to think about how that sort of transformative effort can make a significant difference. So we have just 2 minutes before we're going to turn to audience questions. And I wanted to ask Johanna very quickly. You made the comment at the end of, or at the beginning of the film, "My truth will set me free." And this is when you were
when I was manic and talking about being an alien. You
were very young. You were in a lot of distress. But that was one of the first things we heard from you in this film. And I actually, Johanna, came to believe that. And later on in the film, you wept as you described your dreams, a job, a family, finishing school, and you made the comment that it, quote, just feels out of reach, but I'd like to get to that. And I wondered, have you had support from the mental health system to address those parts of your dreams and your hopes?
For a long time, I didn't, but I just moved back to San Luis Obispo County, which is where I grew up. And I'm actually, for the first time in my life, getting the type of help that is addressing all areas of my life, not just therapy, not just medication, but I had tried before to get other resources, but the wait lists were too long, or I just mentally wasn't doing well enough to get in. But now I am more stable. I'm back with family now, and I just the other day, I mailed in an application for the Department of Vocational Rehab which is a job training program. And I think that might be able to help me get back into school. So I'm very excited. And I have to thank my case manager and my former therapist for getting me into this program. And I'm just very grateful right now. So
Hallelujah.
I'm still in the process. I haven't started yet, but I'm looking forward to it.
Great. All right. Well, I will look forward to hearing how that goes, and have a great deal of confidence that your truth will set you free, and that
Thank you.
you are on a path to that. So I'm going to turn now to the audience questions that have been placed in the chat box. And the first question comes back to you, Johanna. I'm wondering, somebody in the audience is wondering how you've been doing during the pandemic, and wondering, are you connected with friends, family, and providers on a regular basis?
Thank you. I just want to say thank you to the audience for being here and watching. I really appreciate your support and for asking me the question. I feel honored to get the first question. So I'll make it quick. It's funny because during the pandemic, I was kind of grateful because even before the pandemic, I was self-isolating and depressed and not going out. So when it was like, that's what we're supposed to do, instead of being lazy, it made me feel like, okay, I'm good at this. I'm good at the pandemic, but now I'm kind of ready to socialize again. And I've been connected to friends through text. It's hard because the last time I hung out with friends, I had a panic attack, and I felt like, oh my gosh, they don't want to see me. But I think they're genuinely busy, because they said, they're like, no, we understand. They've been through anxiety too, so they weren't freaked out like that I thought they were. So my friends have been busy, so that's been kind of hard. But I've been in touch with family, which has been good, and I'm living with my brother right now. And my providers have been pretty good, especially my case manager. And I'm starting with a new therapist, so it's going okay.
Yeah, it sounds like it's going a lot like it is for the rest of us, in terms of being ready to be done with it. It's one thing to get good at the pandemic, but none of us
liked it at first, though. I'll admit I did like it at first, which is terrible to say.
Right. Yeah. There are silver linings for sure. So Leshar, the next question's for you, Leshar. An audience member asked, how do you balance safety of the person and the autonomy of a person in your practice?
Oh boy, yeah. I mean, I think above all, the essential component of that is recognizing someone's humanity. That's something that just comes easily for me, and I understand that for other providers, other people who work in a hospital setting, it's sometimes easier to disconnect emotionally for many reasons, because it's overwhelming, and I think that it's a really fine line sometimes to walk. And certainly there are times, like in the movie, the incident with Todd, where I've been threatened and had been attacked in many ways in the emergency room. That was truly one of the worst ones that just happened to be captured by Ken and his film crew. I think that, I can, the only reason, I was scared out of my mind when he ran after me and said he was going to try and kill me. I can't pretend that was like just no big deal. But part of my training, and I think, every doctor's training, is that you recognize that there's a human being in front of you who needs care, and it's your responsibility and duty, as we swear an oath to it, to provide the best care we can. And so, I can then after having been chased and having my little heart attack, I can then, turn around and do what needs to be done and do his physical exam and order medication and whatever else needs to happen. But I think the essential component in that care is not forgetting, that there's this person in front of you who's struggling and have their own demons that they're battling, and frankly, it has very little to do with you, as you learn. Yeah, that would be my answer.
Yeah. Seeing the humanity, number one, not taking it personally. It has very little to do with you, number two. Things we hear a lot in the field, but when you are being, have the finger pointed at you or being chased down the hall, it's hard to hold those truths. So this next question is for Amy. When might someone know that they're ready to use their lived experience to help others?
Well, honestly, I think that you could use your lived experience at many stages in the recovery process. I don't think there's any particular prerequisite in terms of how far along you are. I think that I would want the person to have enough insight into their disorders that they could be of support and be a good role model. I know that I'm a better peer specialist now than I was back in 2009 when I was trained, because I've done the work of learning about myself and my patterns and how to take care of myself better so that I stay well.
Yeah. So having some perspective and having some self-knowledge has been really helpful for you. But it also interesting, you made the comment, I think we're all able to help others at various points in our own journey. And I think that's also a very universal experience, right? There isn't a switch, is there? You're now okay to be of help to others.
Yeah, and actually this is funny, but I would say we're all kind of in recovery. We're
all recovering from something, aren't we?
Yeah.
The next question I would ask the panel, how do we help other mental health, corrections professionals to approach their work with compassion? And particularly at times where, the Leshar, you talked about the dehumanized conditions that people sometimes show up at the hospital, having been in their own feces or urine, having maggots on them, et cetera. And I think to many people that invokes a sense of empathy. To some people, it might invoke a sense of disgust and further serve to dehumanize. How have you found it possible to help trainees, to help others as a peer, to Johanna, to help others as somebody who is recovering, to use compassion and find compassion?
I can just say for my students, because I spend an enormous amount of time training medical students and residents who will either go on to be in psychiatry or another field, but inevitably they'll be taking care of people with mental illness. It's sort of a constant reminder. I mean, there's some people who just get it and some people who don't. And I remember I had one particular student who, it was just sort of appalling how distanced he had become from the person in front of him. And so I just had to have a talk with him and remind him, when you're in the hospital, it becomes very comfortable to see IV poles and fluorescent lights, and the nurses and the doctors are actually whole human beings because you spent so much time with them. But to someone coming into a hospital, it's a really scary place. It's not at all homey in any sense of the word. It's not a welcoming environment. And so you have to remember how frightening it is for that person, and how it's your job to sort of be the ambassador and remind them that, yeah, I'm a human being, you're a human being, and we're here to kind of figure things out and find a better path for you. It's just sort of like a constant bell I have to ring with them.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Leshar, and we are to the last question, and I'm going to give Ken the last word. Ken, the final audience question is, are there any policies or proposed regulations that are coming up to possibly address the interests that this film presents that we can support and or advocate for?
Great question. Well, since I'm going to have the last word, I just want to, first of all, thank Vinfen, thank my fellow panelists, and actually thank you, Steve. You put so much thought and work into this. I really do appreciate it. There's lots of organizations that have their finger on the pulse of that. And I think that the best thing is, if you want to get involved, and this film is a call to action, right? And we see in this film how taking that call to action very seriously, as Patrice does, as now Dr. McGhee does, that, and Dr. Dias does in the film, that taking that call to action to heart and doing something really probably makes you a better doctor, but certainly, moves the needle in terms of your care. But there are organizations I suggest you reach out to. Vinfen might be one of them. The National Alliance on Mental Illness, NAMI, is another organization. Lots of bills always on the floor of Congress that we should be supporting. A Treatment Advocacy Center is another place that has lots of good support. So I think that, it's not hard. I mean, there's a wonderful group in Los Angeles called Justice LA, and you can find them very easily. You can certainly support groups like Black Lives Matter that are the subject in our film. Patrice Cullors co-founded and now is executive director of. So I think that I would suggest you go to those organizations. The one thing I also tell people to do is just talk about themselves. This is not someone else's problem, as we know from the film, as we know from our lives. This affects all of us. 50% of us need some major psychiatric help at some point in our lives. I would venture to say most of us need that, and a fair number of us have serious problems. So I think that the best way you can advocate for change is to let everyone know this is not someone else's story, this is our story.
Yeah, there is a Me Too moment of sorts that we need to have for embracing and recognizing that we're all recovering from something, right? So I'd like to thank you all, Johanna, Amy, Leshar, Ken, and I'd like to thank our audience for the time that you spent today watching the film. I would like to encourage everyone to stick around for the next film, Ernie and Joe, Crisis Cops. That will be beginning after a short break, and we thank you all.
Thank you so much. Ernie and Joe is a great film, by the way.
Thank you, Steve.
Hi, everyone. I hope you're enjoying the film festival so far. I know I sure am. These films and panel discussions are truly remarkable. You now have a 15-minute break, so grab a snack, take a break, and return at 2:20 to begin the last film and live panel of the day. See you soon.